been through all the multiple phases of conflict. We're just ringing up to describe the latest stage of the military operations. And of course, those who've been following it, we've been through the rationale. We know how it relates to surge, relates to creating space, relates to shaping the environment, relates to keeping people on the move before the elections and so on. However, what the Afghans are not perhaps in tune with the rationale, with the big write-ups that the commanders have said to explain the rationale of their interventions. They're saying, look, on the ground, the Afghans don't believe that the operations can deliver what they're supposed to, because none of the Afghans in the areas where the forces have now moved into believe in the capacity and intent of the Afghan government and US, our forces, to stay there. That they don't believe that they're going to be there long enough to guarantee that Taliban don't come back and cut off the heads of people who've been involved in collaborating with us. They don't believe that the promises of the community development, infrastructure work and so on, which have been hinted at in the early shuras, which have been conducted in the immediate wake of the operations, that they're going to be delivered on. And they're not confident that they're ever going to see an end to the abusive side of military operations. However much we put spin on them, nobody likes a military operation conducted in their area. You have conduct a military operation somewhere in the US, nobody actually likes it there. Sometimes they want the benefits of it, the security, but they don't actually like to be at the rough end. So, I mean, the hope is that it doesn't turn out to be something like what the IFED pros were doing. We had to do something, so this is it. And then finally, before I'm not going to say get completely intellectual, go slightly intellectual, just a reflection. I mean, I got caught out for talking to Taliban, and and I did. Men aren't very good at saying sorry, but if trying a little bit to promote reconciliation, peace, if it be a sin, mea culpa, I'm a sinner and I'm a repeat sinner. So. One of my latest conversations with a commander who's very much involved on the other side in the insurgency, and is still risking his life and persuading young men to risk their lives to fight against NATO forces. When you sit down and actually open up, I mean, however much you get inside his soul. That particular group of fighters, they have a conception of what they're fighting as national resistance. They have a conception that they are fighting to remove foreign forces. They have got very little conception of end state in terms of institutions or how Afghanistan will run as being terribly different from what they expect to be done. They haven't thought that through. They didn't have any particular political ambition to say, aha, this is a power grab. They have some idea of wanting to go home and live normally after it's over. And of course, any of us who've done the kind of negotiating that Alex mentioned, I've done over the years. We're used to tactical play, used to trying to guess what they're at, and we know it's Afghanistan. There always there's a dialogue inside a dialogue inside a dialogue. But when you manage to sit someone down by the riverbank, and you're drinking lots of cups of tea, and you've got a long-term relationship, you can get little glimpses inside the soul. That wasn't tactical. So of course, now I'm able to say, look, you sort of hint back to the story of the families in the tents, and what was the rationale of the Chapter 7 intervention, and saying, look, nobody wants to occupy your land. President Obama has made it clear. If you need it more clear again in the Cairo speech, do you realize that you are persuading young men to go out and give their lives fighting for something that basically everybody on the other side is already committed to, and vice versa? Again, before we get onto the minor intellectual part of it, I mean, I find it deeply emotionally troubling that we haven't got an effective political and reconciliation process. When, if you go by the non-tricky accounts of what people are fighting for, there's major convergence in the aspiration of the different sides. that everybody claims to be wanting peace and stability in Afghanistan, with the security of Afghanistan maintained by Afghan forces who are subject to the rule of law. I mean, everybody on every side says they want it. So where's the political process to deliver it? Okay. I mean, there are a few points in the book. I mean, it's about a dozen points. Let me just quickly run through it and read the book if you've got time to get more of the detail. Just after my experience of the mullah explaining that the refugees will inherit the earth, we had the Bonn process, which was supposed to have reconciliation built into it. That the architecture actually looks quite good. It's not. I mean, it's certainly not about occupation. It's about an agreement amongst Afghans after a protracted period of civil war, not just the fight of us versus the Taliban, in which you have agreed institutions, you have a process to strengthen those institutions, and over time, and you have a principle of inclusivity, where those who may be excluded at the start actually are able to come inside, and there are specific references to reconciliation and acknowledgement that reconciliation is necessary. It all looks good. That we shouldn't be sitting here today because Bonn might have been able to fix it. Of course, the reality was that we know that the Bonn Agreement was done in haste. And it had to be done in haste, partly because we weren't ready. We hadn't moved. Guess what? We'd been tardy on the political side of things post September 11th, and lots of resources thrown into the military side. And actually, the military did their job much faster than any of the civilians ever thought they'd be able to. So you had this whole thing of facts were rapidly being created on the ground because one faction who had, not just that they had, the one faction had been more assisted by the United States, as often argued, they're a bit like, they're a little bit, anybody watch their schoolboy football, there's always a certain, soccer, that there's always a certain kind of people who don't do an awful lot of running around. They manage to hang around quite close to the goal, and somebody else puts the ball fairly towards there, and if they can avoid an offside rule, they just tip it in and they claim the goal. Anyway, a faction had got themselves into Kabul on that basis. They were creating facts on the ground by putting in an institution, a temporary administration, which looked awfully as if they would like to sit there and essentially reignite another round of civil war, because it was not a broad nationally representative administration. Bonn had to create a legal basis for an international presence in Afghanistan and the basis of a process which could redress the political imbalance that this temporary administration could have been created. It had to be done fast. So it meant that although there was a principle of inclusion over time, inclusion was not delivered in the interim administration that was signed off in Bonn, where basically everybody who got to the talks got to say, okay, ministry for you, ministry for you, ministry for you, and make sure that the key security ministries go to the faction which had grabbed Kabul, because otherwise, how could you persuade them to sign off on the deal? It's a sort of a gambit, but I know there is an inherent logic to that gambit, but it had to be backed up by subsequent political work, making sure that the others really did come on board. And if you look at the political process, the Bonn Agreement was followed by this provision for Lloyd Jurga in 6 months later, the constitution making, subsequently through to the elections. There were opportunities for those people without whose participation you could not say there was a balanced and sustainable administration. There were opportunities to bring them on board. We didn't manage. It's not that somehow there was there was this great exclusion that somehow anti-terrorist clauses or something prevented us from bringing the missing parts of the Pashtun political universe into the process. There was provision. We didn't manage to do it. Got a few ideas on why that didn't happen in the book, but other people will no doubt have to investigate it further. I propose in the book just one little indicator as to how little progress we made on it, which was 12 out of 142. I mean, it's nice I know that these days you have to have metrics, particularly if you're here. Thank goodness I got away without a PowerPoint today. But this is a metric that one can use, which I think there are 142 names on the UN 1267 sanctions list, which are basically designating the big people of the Taliban. So in a sense, that's the nearest thing you can get to an objective statement of who are recognised as a sort of the ruling elite from the regime which had just been toppled. 12 of those have been brought in to the process subsequently. So 12 out of 142. And if you're talking about a stabilization process which manages sort of to keep the sort of the displaced side on board, if not in power, 12 out of 142 is treading on pretty thin ice. It's not there's been little inclusion of the previous regime, which was part of the Pashtun political universe. Anyway, we didn't manage to get them on board. And if you look at what happened, apart from the fact that in the Lloyd Jirga we only had two or three of the Pashtuns coming on, subsequently of the Taliban Pashtuns coming on, subsequently in the election process, some participation, not much. Other things were going on, in a sense, away underneath the radar, separate from the major political processes, which were, of course, the process of alienation and insider-outsider dealing. This is something which, of course, there's no commitment to it written down in Bonn, but the reality was what happened was that as we put in all the money, put in the forces, put in the support to an Afghan administration, which was, of course, again, the Bonn logic. We were doing that on top of a legacy of multiple complex conflicts, which were all overlapping, and which we, of course, not all of which we understood, some of which many of us have struggled hard to understand. And, of course, conflict actors positioned themselves relative to the new political setup. And many of the people who had been part of the ruling elite at the time that the Taliban came to power, who were the Taliban had taken on and displaced, that the new administration brought them back into positions of power. They used those positions of power to prosecute their old conflicts. But this time they were able to use a terminology which we provided to them. Particularly they used the great terrorist terminology. One of the wonderful little sort of linguistic coincidences rather than sort of something that you could explain using Chomsky, is that terror, the Persian word to kill, murder, is rather close to terror. And so when the word terrorist has got a certain resonance, people, in a sense, Afghans already understand it, reflecting to terror. So basically, that the parts of the new establishment had an opportunity to label their rivals as terrorists. And cut a long story short, in the period of late 2001, 2002, many of those who had survived from the old regime, the Taliban regime, who had expected to be able to stay on in Afghanistan and join the new setup. Basically, they expect to be able to go home. Taliban regime, it's over. There's a new Afghanistan. We'll be part of it as well. We always, we've always done that. We always know how to switch sides. We're highly pragmatic. They go home. Instead, they end up being labelled as terrorists. Some of us are looking for terrorists. Thank goodness we found some, because this helpful man here has brought some terrorists to us. We raid their houses. Anyway, we drive many of them to Pakistan. We sow the seeds of a future insurgency. Because when you look at when you document how the insurgency originated, many of the specific fronts, I mean, places that areas where specific groups of fighters came together, they were initiated around a sort of little pearl that had been formed of alienated former fighters who had tried to accommodate themselves to the new setup but were rejected and were driven out. And it's something to remember that sometimes when people talk somewhat laxly about how we got here in the conflict in Afghanistan, we sort of think of the fight today as a direct continuity of the fight of October and November 2001. That's not the case. if you actually, although, okay, maybe there's been, maybe there's been no month when there's been complete peace inside Afghanistan. There have been, you have to go back and periodize the conflict. You had, okay, so there's a tough fight during October and November, and you can date it up to December. You can perhaps take it through to February 2002 with the battle in Shahikot under Operation Anaconda. But then for the rest of 2002, essentially the confrontation with Al-Qaeda Taliban is, to all intents and purposes, is over. It's finished. I mean, of course, there's a bit of mopping up going on, but there's no major organized resistance coming from their side. And actually, the conflict during 2002 was a different conflict entirely. There are 12 major armed clashes, which I've documented during that period. All of them were, I forget how the colours are. I think, is it green on green, blue on blue? What do you call it?
Green on green,
our friends. Yeah, it's our friends versus our friends. In just about all of those dozen conflicts in 2002, Marshal Fahim, then the defence minister and soon to become vice president, perhaps, he was arming both sides. There was it was not surprising that we should be through that. There were policy measured responses to that. I certainly was, as a UN officer, I would be woken up early in the morning by the sort of ComISAF to go and jump on a plane with Asif Dilawar and various people, to go and do little bits of firefighting. And then there was strategic work, which was done as a shift over to SSR, DDR, that the Finance Minister Ashraf Ghani, being extremely decisive in his intervention in trying to cut off the financing of the people who were running these militias. And actually, I think there was if I'm not wrong, Wazir Saab, there was this showdown between Marshal Fahim and Ashraf Ghani, where it basically came to it's either him or it's me, because Marshal Saab was committed to, he was doing political patronage, building up a constituency, trying to make sure that he was a force in the new Afghanistan at the cost of sustaining conflict, and Finance Minister Ashraf Ghani was committed to reining in the financing of that and using a strategic approach to removing the basis for continuing conflict. And so, in a sense, we have there are good bits of the story that sometimes people forget. We went through a different conflict during 2002, and actually it was solved, and that's gone, over. Anyway, but subsequently in 2003, you get a new conflict going again, which is the re-emergence of the new Taliban, new movement, a confrontation against the new Afghan government, the Western support of that, and in their recruiting strategy, they fed upon our mistakes, that our failure to see through the anticipated inclusiveness in the post-Bonn setup, and our failure to rein in the alienating practices of the people in the mid-level of the new establishment. Anyway, although that's sort of, those are the frustrating parts when you start to look at the emergence of the new conflict. There are bits of hope when you look at what happened post 2001. 10 minutes, I can manage about 10 minutes. That's right. Some things went right, which give you ideas of where to go to now. That I gave you the figure of 12 people from the old elite who came, who were brought on board. When you start to look at significant figures who've been involved with the Taliban and the insurgency, who have rejected continuing violence and have been incorporated into the new setup. One of the little findings I got as I was doing this was that the big people haven't really come in through organized, institutionalized programs, the kind of thing for which you write a sort of project concept note and budget it and structure it. They've come in through much more informal and Afghan processes, with political patronage being the most obvious one. That they've come in, that the big people have come on board when there's been an influential insider, well placed in the regime, who has the capacity to get things done inside the new setup. When there's a problem, they can pick up the phone and they can talk to somebody in the Interior Ministry and say, look, there's somebody, this has happened to somebody, somebody's brother has been picked up, and they really ought to be inside, and so on. And that these insiders have had some kind of network link, as a bond of comradeship, tribal link with the the excluded members from the Taliban, those are the links that they otherwise combatants have invoked to be, because they're guaranteed a hearing, that they know that that person can't ditch them, can't throw them out. So a little hint that they drawing on the social fabric of Afghan society gives you the most chance of making concrete progress and reconciliation. But when you do start to look at laying the groundwork for what's to be done now, one of the things that we had a sort of a joke earlier on in the year about the idea of we need to open an institute of Taliban studies. I mean, anything which is going to use a political approach to address the current conflict has got to be based on an understanding of the actors of what's happening in the conflict. So there's a lot, and I mean it's remarkable actually how thin the knowledge is. One of the insights which I've suggested, which should be driving approaches to reconciliation, is drop any idea of somehow this grand Leninist organization that is the Taliban. I mean, there's almost like it's a coincidence of history that most of the insurgents are actually labelled as Taliban at the moment. You could say the anthropologists might say they're not real Taliban, but it just happened, that label was applied because who happened to control Kabul and Kandahar just before this thing got going. There's a segmented insurgency. That there are multiple networks which have got their own bonds of comradeship, reasons that people have clustered around a charismatic or powerful commander, and they've all linked up like this, and then somebody applied the label Taliban to them. So this is the kind of insight that you're going to have to do. If you're going to come up ultimately with a political approach to addressing this, you've got to build this kind of insight into your strategy, what you're going to do. Some of the interesting stuff I did in this was just looking at typologies of approaches which have been tried, because quite obviously a lot of things have been tried since 2001. One of the things which I've looked at is the terms of the bargain which is being offered, and I think that I saw it in Patty's notes as well, so she's going to elaborate on it. That the assumption when people inside the current regime, Karzai's regime, and from our side, when they started trying to come up with formal approaches to reconciliation. So the idea was that look, history is with us. That we have basically we've stabilized Afghanistan. There's just a bit more mopping up that has to be done. And what we're doing is that the idea of reconciliation is just to complete that mopping up. So we offered something which is called basic co-option. They've done wrong, but fortunately they've come in and they said, "I'm sorry. We've laid down our arms. We swear allegiance to the new setup, and they will be allowed to go home, and they won't get locked up." And that's the formal programs has been based upon that. What I've been suggesting is no major reconciliations have been affected by this, and the current ground reality in terms of the relationship between the Karzai government, our allies, and the non-state actors which have challenged them have changed in such a way that there's very limited mileage to be had from this kind of co-option. One of the things has got to be you've got to move towards an accommodation. Now, accommodation doesn't just mean getting weak. In the context of where I say were the roots of the insurgency, that many of the people who have been driven into the insurgency actually have a set of grievances, which in a sense, it's not that it's out of weakness we'd want to address those. Out of pursuit of social justice, it's part of our core mission to adjust those. So there's a very legitimate case to be made for inducing an accommodation process where the terms of a bargain are not just come in, lay down your arms, say sorry, but actually work out what went wrong to drive those people into the conflict in the first place. And if it really is, for example, a wayward district governor who is deliberately trying to drive the other tribe out, address that. With mind to your 10 minutes, I put 5. Good. Yeah, I'm getting there. A quick little note: Pakistan can help. It's what I said in my, the speaking point. The point that so far, one of the main things that all the things that international community or the US have been asking Pakistan to do in this process have basically been asked. I mean, it's obviously been asking for concrete security cooperation, facilitate access for various kinds of military forces, arrest people, don't make too much trouble when we kill people. I mean, broadly, that's the cooperation which has been looked at for Pakistan. As it happens, that there's been an interesting, there has, yeah, even before there was much talk of reconciliation on the international side, some of the Pakistani actors had been saying, well, you know, what more can be done to push ahead with the inclusiveness you said you were going to do? Get those people who are currently involved in the insurgency actually politically incorporated in the new setup inside Afghanistan. Concretely, there is cooperation which Pakistan can be requested to supply on that, which may be more palatable than the thing which they've always been, they've been very effective at dodging, which is in the sense that the major arrests. Because we know the history that there have been a lot of arrests of Al-Qaeda inside Pakistan, that the track record on moves against the Taliban have been much more limited. It's not the time to go into all the details of the mechanics of what can be done on reconciliation from our side, but at least one can say that there must be continuing robust international support, which means in terms of whatever's going to be done on reconciliation, international actors are going to have to fund it. We need to put resources behind it. When you think of the vast resources which are committed to the military side, an appropriate allocation towards reconciliation, as long as we're doing the right thing, makes sense. But also, I argue, and it's a slight hint of controversy in it, that there is a scope for the international side to be involved in dialogue, actually doing some of the reconciliation dialogue, because hitherto the doctrine in reconciliation has been that the Afghan government must directly lead all reconciliation efforts, and all the international community do was help when asked. That one of the things that I propose is that the reality is, as the conflict transformed,